The door had already clicked half shut when Hyunjin's voice broke through the dark. "Leave tonight." Froze with one hand still on the handle, the cold metal pressing into his palm, while silence swallowed the room so completely he could hear Hyunjin breathing behind him. Shallow, uneven, wrong. It was the kind of voice Felix had never heard from him before. Not from the man who carried himself like elegance sharpened into something untouchable. Not from the man who wore silence like armor and turned every room into something smaller just by standing in it. Hyunjin had always been many things, beautiful, unreadable, impossible, but never fragile, never this. Rain tapped softly against the studio windows, thin and restless, streaking the city lights into blurred ribbons across the glass. Somewhere below, traffic murmured through the midnight streets, distant and muted, like another life happening far away from this one. Inside the practice room, everything smelled faintly of sweat-wet pavement, and the cheap coffee Felix had abandoned an hour ago when rehearsal ran too long, and conversation ran even longer. Felix turned slowly. Hyunjin was still sitting on the floor where rehearsal had ended, one knee bent, his back resting against the mirrored wall. The overhead lights had been switched off except for the dim lamp in the corner, leaving the room painted in amber and shadow. It softened the sharpness of him, blurred the edges of his beauty, but it did nothing to hide the way his hands trembled where they rested over his knees. For one disorienting second, Felix thought he was sick. Then Hyunjin looked up, and Felix understood it was worse than that. His eyes were too open, too unguarded. There was something in them Felix had spent years trying not to name, something raw and exhausted and terrifyingly close to grief. Hyunjin. Felix's voice came out quieter than he meant it to. Hyunjin swallowed, the movement visible in the hollow of his throat. He looked like he regretted speaking already, like asking had cost him something he hadn't meant to give away, but he said it again anyway, softer this time. "Leave." Let the door fall shut behind him. The click sounded louder than it should have. For a long moment neither of them moved. Felix had known Hyunjin long enough to understand his silences had texture. Some were easy, familiar things, comfortable quiets shared in the backseat after schedules, in dressing rooms while everyone else shouted over each other, in the soft hour after midnight when exhaustion made even breathing feel intimate. Those silences were warm, effortless. This one was different. This one felt like standing too close to the edge of something. Felix crossed the room slowly, shoes whispering against the hardwood. Up close, Hyunjin looked worse. There were shadows under his eyes deep enough to bruise. His hair was damp at the temples, whether from sweat or rain Felix couldn't tell. His lips were parted slightly as if breathing had become something he had to remember to do. Felix crouched in front of him. What happened? Hyunjin gave a small laugh that didn't sound like one. He dropped his gaze almost immediately, staring instead at Felix's hands resting on his knees. Nothing. Almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. Hyunjin had always said nothing like it was a reflex. Like if he repeated it enough it would become true. Felix leaned forward, elbows braced loosely against his thighs. "You look like you're about to fall apart." Silence. Then almost inaudibly Hyunjin said, "Maybe I am." Something inside Felix went still. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city, soft enough to feel more than here. Hyunjin had never been easy to know. Felix had learned that early in fragments. In the way Hyunjin smiled brightest when cameras were pointed at him and went strangely quiet after. In the way he laughed too hard when he was tired. In the way he stayed up later than everyone else and slept less than anyone should. In the way he touched things gently, fabric, paintbrushes, the edge of a glass, as if he were always afraid of leaving damage behind. Felix had spent years learning the shape of him through what Hyunjin did not say. But this was different. This was not one of Hyunjin's careful silences. This was something split open. Felix sat down in front of him without thinking, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "Talk to me." Hyunjin's mouth curved, but there was no humor in it. He dragged one hand over his face, slow and tired. "You make it sound simple. It can be." Hyunjin looked at him then, really looked at him, and Felix felt the full weight of that gaze settle somewhere under his ribs. "No," Hyunjin said quietly. "Not when it's you." The words landed harder than they should have. Felix's breath caught so faintly he hoped Hyunjin hadn't heard it. Rain pressed harder against the windows. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, the air heavier than before. Hyunjin lowered his gaze again, jaw tight enough Felix could see the tension there. "I had a bad night," he said after a while, voice rough around the edges. "And I didn't want to be alone." It was such a small confession, barely anything at all. It hit Felix harder than if Hyunjin had screamed, because Hyunjin did not ask for people. He did not ask to be stayed with. He did not ask, full stop. And yet Felix softened before he could stop himself. "What kind of bad night?" Hyunjin exhaled through his nose, humorless. "The kind where everything gets loud." Felix frowned. Hyunjin tapped 2 fingers against his temple, eyes unfocused now, fixed somewhere over Felix's shoulder. "The kind where your head won't stop. Where every mistake you've ever made starts sounding bigger than it is. Where every room feels too small and every silence feels like drowning." Went very still. He knew something about that kind of night, more than he liked to admit. Hyunjin laughed again, quieter now, almost ashamed of the sound. "I know how this sounds. Human." That pulled a real reaction out of him, small, startled, but real. Hyunjin looked at Felix like he'd been caught off guard by kindness. It made something ache in Felix's chest. Hyunjin's fingers flexed once over his knee. "I almost called you an hour ago." Felix's heart stumbled. "Why didn't you?" Hyunjin's gaze dropped to Felix's mouth and stayed there just long enough to make the air shift. Then almost helplessly he said, "Because I knew if you came I wouldn't want you to leave." The world did not stop, rain still fell. The city still breathed below them. Somewhere a car horn sounded and faded into distance, but something changed shape in the room all the same. Felix felt it in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the way Hyunjin was looking at him now, too tired to hide, too worn down to pretend this was ordinary. In the way Felix suddenly understood this had never been only about tonight, every late silence, every too long glance, every unfinished sentence suspended between them for months. Felix had always thought the tension between them was survivable as long as neither of them touched it. Now it sat between them, alive and breathing. Hyunjin's voice dropped, quieter than the rain. Tired, Felix had heard him say that before, after schedules, after rehearsals, after flights and cameras and too many expectations stacked on top of too little sleep. But this was not exhaustion. This was confession sharpened into something softer and more dangerous. "I'm tired of pretending I'm okay when I'm not," Hyunjin said. "And I'm tired of acting like it doesn't matter when you leave a room and I feel it for hours after." Forgot how to breathe. Hyunjin looked horrified the second the words were out, as if hearing them aloud had made them too real to survive. He turned his face away, a fracture of embarrassment crossing his expression. "I shouldn't have said that." Felix was already reaching for him, not dramatically, not like something out of a film, just a hand, warm and careful, closing around Hyunjin's wrist before he could retreat too far into himself. The contact startled them both. Hyunjin went still. Felix's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Then don't ask me to pretend I didn't hear it." Hyunjin looked at him. And for the first time that night, Felix saw it plainly. Fear, yes, but beneath it something even more dangerous. Hope. It was so naked on Hyunjin's face that Felix felt his own chest tighten around it. He had seen Hyunjin angry, radiant, teasing, cold, brilliant, undone by laughter. He had never seen him hopeful, not like this. It was devastating. Felix's thumb moved once against the inside of Hyunjin's wrist. A small, unconscious gesture, but Hyunjin reacted like he'd been touched somewhere deeper. His breath caught. Felix felt it happen and knew, suddenly and terribly, that neither of them had been imagining this. Not the pauses, not the tension, not the ache, not any of it. The realization should have frightened him more than it did. Instead, what Felix felt was a strange, aching kind of relief, like finding the wound and realizing it had already been open for a long time. Hyunjin's voice was almost unrecognizable when he spoke again. "I don't know how to do this." Fingers tightened around his wrist, gentle and sure. "Neither do I." It was the most honest thing he could have said, and maybe honesty tonight was enough. So Felix stayed. He stayed when the rain softened into a hush against the windows. He stayed when Hyunjin's breathing finally began to even out. He stayed when silence settled over them again, no longer sharp enough to cut. He stayed close enough to feel the warmth of Hyunjin beside him, close enough to hear the quiet stutter of breath that said he was still holding himself together by threads. And when Hyunjin finally leaned into him, Small, hesitant, like he was still expecting to be refused. Felix did not move away. He let Hyunjin rest there, all sharp edges and quiet ruin, and listened to the storm pass around them. By the time morning began to pale the windows silver, neither of them had slept. But Hyunjin's hand had found Felix's sometime in the dark, and neither of them had let go. Morning arrived slowly, like something afraid to interrupt them. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed clean and pale beyond the studio windows. Gray light spilled across the hardwood floor in soft, colorless bands, touching the edges of abandoned water bottles, tangled charger cords. Hyunjin's jacket crumpled near the mirror. The room looked ordinary in daylight. Too ordinary for what had settled into it overnight. Felix became aware of two things at once. The first was the ache in his neck from sleeping half-sitting against the mirrored wall. The second was Hyunjin's hand still wrapped around his, not loosely. Not by accident. Even in sleep, Hyunjin held on like letting go required effort he didn't have. Felix stayed still. Hyunjin was asleep against his shoulder, head tipped slightly forward, his breathing deep, and even for the first time in hours. In sleep, something in him looked younger, softer. The tension that usually sharpened his face had eased, leaving only exhaustion and the kind of vulnerability Hyunjin would probably hate being caught in. Felix looked at him for a long moment, at the loose fall of dark hair over his forehead, at the faint crease between his brows that hadn't fully disappeared even in sleep, at the quiet rise and fall of his chest, at the hand holding his as if Felix had become something solid enough to anchor to. A strange tenderness moved through him, slow and deep enough to hurt. It would have been easier if Hyunjin had said nothing. If last night had stayed what it could have pretended to be, fatigue, stress, a bad night made softer by company. But Hyunjin had said too much and Felix had understood all of it. That was the problem. Now the silence between them had shape. Now Felix knew exactly what lived in it. He should have felt trapped by that realization. Cornered, maybe. The kind of fear that came with standing too close to something irreversible. Instead, what he felt was a dangerous kind of calm. As if some part of him had been waiting for this long before his mind had caught up. Hyunjin stirred. It started small, a shift of breath, a faint tightening of fingers around Felix's hand, the slow pull back into consciousness. Then Hyunjin's lashes fluttered open, unfocused at first, gaze still blurred with sleep. For 3 quiet seconds he looked peaceful, then memory hit. Felix saw it happen in real time. The soft haze vanished from Hyunjin's expression. Awareness flooded in, sharp and immediate. His eyes dropped to their joined hands, to where his shoulder was still resting against Felix's. Felix watched the exact moment panic tried to settle in. Hyunjin pulled back too quickly, not far, just enough to put space where there hadn't been any. He let go of Felix's hand like the contact had only just begun to burn. For a second he said nothing. Then, rough with sleep and embarrassment, I fell asleep. Looked down at his empty hand. Seems like it. Hyunjin made a quiet sound that might have been humiliation disguised as a laugh. He dragged a hand through his hair and sat up straighter, every line of his body already trying to reconstruct itself into something more familiar. Composed. Untouchable. Felix recognized the retreat immediately. The walls were going back up. It was almost impressive how fast Hyunjin could do it. By the time he stood, the softness from the night before had already been tucked away so neatly Felix might have thought he imagined it if not for the ache still lingering in his own chest. Hyunjin bent to grab his jacket from the floor, movements too casual to be natural. Sorry about last night. Felix's gaze lifted. There it was, not good morning. Not thank you, sorry. Hyunjin avoided looking at him as he shrugged his jacket on. I was tired. I said too much. Felix felt something in him tight. The morning suddenly seemed colder than it had a second ago. You mean you were honest? Hyunjin's jaw flexed. He still didn't look at Felix. I was exhausted. Stood. The room felt smaller the second he did. And that changes what you said. Hyunjin finally looked at him then. That would have been easier if he'd looked annoyed. Easier if he'd looked detached, dismissive, careless. Instead he looked cornered, which was somehow worse. You know what I mean. No, Felix said, quieter than anger but sharper than gentleness. I don't think I do. Hyunjin's throat moved. For one brief second, Felix thought he might say it again. Something real, something honest enough to leave a mark. Instead, Hyunjin looked away. That's exactly why I shouldn't have said any of it. The words landed clean and cold. Felix stared at him, not because they hurt, because they did. Because part of him had stayed through the night and let something fragile exist between them, only for Hyunjin to try and bury it under daylight like it had been a mistake. Felix laughed once under his breath, disbelieving. Right. Hyunjin's gaze snapped back to him. Felix grabbed his bag from the floor, slinging the strap over his shoulder with more force than necessary. Felix. No. Felix's voice stayed calm, which made it cut deeper. You don't get to do that. Hyunjin stilled. What? Ask me to stay, Felix said, looking at him fully now, and then act like it meant nothing once the sun comes up. Hyunjin's expression shifted, small, almost imperceptible, but Felix saw it, saw exactly where the words landed. It didn't mean nothing. Then stop talking like it did. Hyunjin's mouth parted, closed. For someone who knew how to turn words into weapons when he wanted to, he looked suddenly, infuriatingly defenseless. Felix hated how much that still affected him. He hated that even now, with frustration tightening in his chest and disappointment sitting ugly under his ribs, part of him still wanted to cross the room and make this easier for both of them. Instead, he stood still. Hyunjin's voice, when it came, was quieter. You think I don't know what last night meant? Felix said nothing. Hyunjin laughed once, bitter and soft. That's the problem. Something in Felix's anger faltered. Hyunjin dropped onto the edge of the bench near the mirror as if standing had become too much effort. He leaned forward, forearms braced against his knees, gaze fixed on the floor. When he spoke again, the words came slower, less polished, harder to hide inside. I know exactly what it meant. Stayed where he was, fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. Hyunjin stared at the ground as though it were easier than looking at him. That's why I'm trying to ruin it before it ruins me. Air left Felix's lungs in a quiet, startled breath. Hyunjin smiled then, but it was the kind of smile people wore when they were already bleeding somewhere no one could see. I'm not good at this, Felix said nothing, not because he didn't have words, because he had too many. Hyunjin dragged a hand over his face. You think I didn't mean it, he said. I meant all of it, every second of it. I meant don't leave. I meant stay. I meant I feel it every time you walk out of a room like you're taking something with you. His voice roughened. That is exactly why this is a problem. Heartbeat had become something too loud to ignore. Hyunjin let out a slow breath and finally looked at him. There was no armor in his face now, no elegance, no careful distance, only honesty and the damage it did to him. You are the one person I don't know how to want safely. Forgot every prepared defense he'd built in the last 5 minutes. The words hit too deep for anger to survive them. Hyunjin laughed quietly at his own wreckage. You make me reckless. Something hot and aching twisted under Felix's ribs. He should have said something then, something careful, something measured. Instead, what came out was the truth. Do you think you're the only one? Hyunjin went still. The room seemed to hold its breath around them. Felix hadn't meant to say it, or maybe he had, and he'd only just run out of reasons not to. Hyunjin stared at him with an expression Felix had never seen before, shock stripped so bare it almost looked like fear. Felix swallowed once, pulse too loud in his throat. You think this has only been difficult for you? Hyunjin didn't answer, couldn't, maybe. Felix stepped closer, then stopped. The space between them suddenly charged enough to feel physical. I stayed, Felix said, quieter now. Not because you asked, because I wanted to. Hyunjin looked at him like the sentence had altered gravity. Felix's voice softened despite himself. I stayed because when you said don't leave, it sounded like the most honest thing I'd ever heard from you. Something in Hyunjin's face broke open, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for Felix to see how badly he'd wanted to hear that, and that more than anything undid him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had stopped pretending not to feel. Morning light stretched wider across the floor. The city outside had fully woken now, all distant engines and movement and life continuing without permission. Inside the studio, neither of them moved. Felix could hear Hyunjin breathing, could hear his own, could feel the fragile, terrifying shape of something new unfolding between them, something with no clear edges, no guarantees, no easy way forward. But for the first time, it was real enough to touch, and neither of them looked away. Neither of them moved for so long that the morning began to feel suspended around them, stretched thin between one breath and the next. Hyunjin was still sitting on the bench, elbows braced against his knees, looking up at Felix like he had been handed something far too fragile to trust. The light from the windows caught in his eyes and made them look brighter than they should have, sharp with exhaustion and something softer that Felix still didn't know how to survive. Outside, the city had fully woken. Tires hissed against wet pavement. Somewhere below, a delivery truck groaned to a stop. The world kept moving with cruel indifference, ordinary and loud and alive, while inside the studio everything had narrowed to the space between them. Felix became suddenly aware of his own pulse, of the weight of the silence, of the fact that he had crossed a line with no idea how to cross back. Hyunjin stood first, not abruptly, not like retreat. Slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might fracture whatever had just surfaced between them. He was close enough now that Felix could smell rain still clinging faintly to his jacket, clean cotton, the stale trace of coffee from the night before. Familiar things. Dangerous, suddenly, in how intimate they felt. Hyunjin's gaze dropped briefly to Felix's mouth before returning to his eyes. It was such a small movement Felix might have missed it if the room were not so unbearably quiet. But he saw it. And once seen, it changed everything. Something warm and electric moved low under Felix's ribs. Neither of them spoke. There were 100 ways this could still be ruined. A joke. A deflection. One step backward. One badly chosen word and the entire fragile shape of this morning would collapse into something easier to deny. Felix knew Hyunjin knew that too. And yet Hyunjin stayed where he was, close enough now that the distance between them felt less like space and more like restraint. When he spoke, his voice had gone quiet in a different way than before, not frayed, careful. "If I say something now," he said, "I need you to know I won't know how to take it back." Felix's throat tightened. "Then don't say something you'll want to." Hyunjin gave a breath of laughter that barely existed, his eyes never leaving Felix's. "That's the problem." Hand lifted. For one suspended second Felix thought Hyunjin might touch him. Instead, Hyunjin's fingers stopped just short of his face, hesitating there like even this required permission. Felix felt the pause like a held breath. Then he leaned just barely into the space between them. It was enough. Hyunjin's fingertips brushed the line of Felix's jaw so lightly it almost didn't count. Almost. The touch was brief, careful, barely there. It still sent something sharp and immediate through Felix's chest. Hyunjin exhaled like the contact had cost him. Felix had been touched 1,000 times in 1,000 thoughtless ways, crowded backstage moments. Hands on shoulders, arms brushing in passing, casual contact made meaningless by repetition. This was not thoughtless. This was one deliberate touch, so gentle it felt more intimate than being held. Hyunjin's hand dropped almost immediately, as though he'd only just realized what he'd done. Felix caught his wrist before he could pull away. The movement surprised both of them. Hyunjin stilled. Felix's fingers wrapped around the inside of his wrist, warm over the quick jump of pulse there. He didn't let go. Something in Hyunjin's expression shifted, something startled and unguarded and almost unbearably open. Felix had spent too long letting Hyunjin retreat first. Too long letting silence do the work. Words were too afraid to touch. Not this time. "You keep asking me to stay," Felix said, voice low enough that it barely disturbed the air between them. "But you keep standing like you're the one waiting to be left." Hyunjin's breath caught. Felix felt it under his fingertips. For one long second Hyunjin said nothing. Then with a kind of honesty that felt less like courage and more like surrender, he said, "I usually am." Answer landed somewhere deep enough to bruise. Felix looked at him, really looked at him, and saw it all at once, not just the exhaustion from last night, not just fear, pattern, habit, the instinctive retreat, the polished distance. The way Hyunjin always stepped away first, spoke less, smiled easier than he confessed. The way he made himself hard to reach before anyone could prove they were willing to leave, not pride, protection. Something in Felix's chest ached with sudden clarity. He loosened his hold just enough for the gesture to become less restraint and more choice, but he didn't let go. "You make it very easy to think you don't need anyone." Hyunjin's smile was small and tired and a little sad. "I've had practice." Hated how quietly that hurt. The morning light had turned pale gold at the windows now, warming the edges of the room. It caught in Hyunjin's hair, softened the severity of his face, made him look younger and more tired and infinitely less untouchable than he ever let anyone see. Felix wondered, not for the first time, how many versions of Hyunjin existed only in hidden hours like this one. How many had gone unseen because no one stayed long enough to notice. Hyunjin looked at Felix's hand still around his wrist. His voice came softer. "You should let go." Pulse stumbled once, not because of the words, because of the way Hyunjin said them, not like a command, like a test. Felix held his gaze. "I don't want to." Changed in Hyunjin's face, then small, immediate, impossible to miss. Not relief exactly, something more dangerous. The fragile disbelief of someone watching hope become real in real time. Hyunjin's throat moved. Felix could feel his pulse under his fingers, too fast now, no steadier than his own. Neither of them seemed to know what to do with that, so, inevitably, Hyunjin ruined it first. He laughed under his breath and looked away, the sound thin with nerves. "You know this gets complicated the second we stop pretending." Almost smiled. "There it is." Hyunjin glanced back, faintly defensive. "There what is?" "You." Felix let his hand fall away then, slow enough to feel the loss of contact the second it happened. The moment something becomes real and you immediately try to make it sound impossible. Hyunjin opened his mouth, closed it again. Felix's smile faded before it could become anything warm. "I'm not saying it isn't complicated." Step back just enough to breathe without feeling Hyunjin's warmth. "I'm saying that's a terrible excuse to keep lying." Hyunjin went still. The words sat between them, cleaner than cruelty and sharper than comfort. Felix watched them land, watched Hyunjin absorb them in silence. Then Hyunjin did something unexpected. He laughed, not bitterly, not to deflect, a quiet, disbelieving laugh that sounded almost like he'd been caught. "You really do make this impossible," folded his arms. "That's not what impossible means." Hyunjin looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his expression. Then to Felix's complete surprise, he smiled, not the practiced one. Not the effortless, beautiful thing he wore for cameras and strangers, something smaller, real enough to feel intimate. It changed his whole face. Felix's breath caught before he could stop it. Hyunjin noticed. Of course he did. The smile softened at the edges into something quieter. "See," he murmured. Felix frowned. "See what?" Hyunjin took one step closer again, not enough to touch, enough to make Felix stop breathing for one deeply inconvenient second. "This," Hyunjin said, gaze dropping briefly to Felix's mouth and then rising again. "Complicated." Should have looked away, he didn't, and maybe that was answer enough for both of them. The room had gone silent again, but no longer with uncertainty. This silence had changed shape. It no longer felt like avoidance, it felt like waiting. Hyunjin's voice was almost gentle when he spoke next. "I don't know what this becomes." Held his gaze. He could hear the honesty in it, the fear, the lack of performance. For once, Hyunjin wasn't trying to sound certain. He was simply telling the truth. Felix let out a slow breath. "Then maybe we stop deciding what it is before it gets the chance to become anything." Hyunjin looked at him like the idea itself had never occurred to him, which Felix realized it probably hadn't. Hyunjin had always treated feeling like something to control before it controlled him. Felix, despite everything, had always wanted to know what would happen if he stopped. Now, standing in the washed gold quiet of morning with Hyunjin looking at him like something dangerously close to hope, Felix thought maybe he was finally about to find out. Hyunjin's next breath came slower. Then he nodded once, small, careful, real. And for now, somehow, it was enough for a while after that. Neither of them said anything. The silence that settled between them was no longer sharp enough to wound. It was quieter now. Strange, fragile, almost tentative in the way it held them both. Morning had fully unfolded beyond the windows, washing the city in a pale gold haze that made everything outside look softer than it was. Inside the studio, the air still carried the faint smell of rain and sweat and stale coffee, but something in it had changed. Felix could feel it in the way Hyunjin looked at him now, not guarded, not entirely. There was still caution there, still the instinctive hesitation of someone used to stepping carefully around his own feelings, but the distance had shifted. Subtle, irreversible. Hyunjin exhaled and dragged a hand through his hair, gaze dropping to the floor between them. "We should probably leave before someone finds us in here and assumes something dramatic." Felix's mouth twitched despite himself. Something dramatic did happen. That pulled a small smile from Hyunjin. Real enough to matter, he said quietly. That's what worries me. Should have let him retreat into humor. It would have been easier, safer maybe. Instead he said, are you always like this after being honest? Hyunjin glanced up. Terrible. Felix folded his arms. A little. Hyunjin huffed a laugh under his breath, but there was something tired in it. Not unhappy, just exposed. Not used to being seen this clearly. Admission softened something in Felix before he could stop it. He wanted to ask who had taught Hyunjin that being understood should feel dangerous. He wanted to ask how long he had been making himself smaller in all the wrong places just to avoid being hurt in the right ones. Instead, Felix said the simpler thing. You're still here. Hyunjin looked at him. It was such a small sentence. Barely anything. But Felix saw the way it landed. Hyunjin's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Felix to realize no one had ever offered him gentleness without making it feel conditional. No wonder he kept waiting for the moment it would be taken back. Hyunjin's gaze dropped, then rose again, steadier this time. Are you? Didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth of it was already everywhere in the room. Hyunjin bent to pick up his bag from beside the bench, slinging it over one shoulder. The movement restored some of his usual shape, some of the effortless composure that seemed to settle over him the second he remembered how to wear it. But Felix noticed the difference immediately. The walls were back, just not as high. They left the studio together. The hallway outside was too bright after the dim amber quiet of the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and clinical, making everything feel abruptly more real. The building was waking around them now, distant footsteps, muffled voices somewhere downstairs, the metallic clatter of someone unlocking storage. Felix and Hyunjin walked side by side toward the elevator in a silence that felt different from all the ones before. Not empty, not easy either, just aware. Every brush of movement felt louder than it should have. Every shift in proximity registered too quickly, too clearly. Felix was suddenly conscious of Hyunjin beside him in ways that felt deeply inconvenient, of the heat of him, the quiet sound of his breathing, the fact that one bad decision in an empty hallway would become a memory neither of them would survive gracefully. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. They stepped inside. The doors slid shut. And suddenly the space was too small. Felix became acutely aware of the mirrored walls, of Hyunjin reflected beside him from 3 different angles, of the silence pressing close around them with nowhere to go. Hyunjin leaned back against the wall, arms folded loosely, gaze fixed on the glowing floor numbers above the door. Felix stared at his own reflection and tried not to notice how close they were standing, failed. The elevator